Hey, everybody, welcome back to Keep Calm, It's Just a Snake podcast. Today we have an amazing guest that I'm very much looking forward to speaking with. Honestly, a founder of herpetoculture and the community that we have today. This is Kathy Love. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I would like to think that anybody who's been in the community for more than a couple days has heard of you at least by now. If they don't, they really should have by like honestly, they really have.
Well, we've certainly made a lot of friends over the decades.
Oh yeah. Um, I mean, do you want to just kind of get started and kind of how you got started into everything, and we'll just kind of go from there?
Well, I got kind of started when I was a little kid, and I met my first snake when I was in kindergarten or first grade when a boy chased me home with one.
Oh,
I'd never seen one up close, so I ran along with my friend. And my father said, "No kid of mine is going to be afraid of snakes." He took me over to the neighbor's house, and they had a garter snake that looked like it was about 10 feet long. And I played with it for a while, and he probably regretted that ever since because by the time I was in high school, my room was full of snakes.
oh, jeez. That's crazy. I know a lot of people get started, catching them, and once they get to high school, they maybe have one or two, or as soon as they leave their parents' house, then they go crazy. But oh man,
It was great having a variety of them. I grew up in southeastern Wisconsin, and we didn't see a lot of snakes in the wild. We did live at one point near some den areas where we could find a lot of garter snakes in the spring. But other than that, it was pretty rare to see snakes.
oh man. So were you keeping mostly garters, or what were you keeping at that point?
I did start with a couple of garters, but I really had my sights set on something bigger. And when I was in uh, ninth or 10th grade, and my father gave me permission to get something bigger, I didn't have a job. So there was a pet shop in Milwaukee that would trade garter snakes, take in garter snakes and give you credit towards something else.
Hmm.
So my brothers and I caught a bunch of garter snakes and traded it in on a big Wisconsin bull snake.
Oh, cool.
And that was exciting. Of course, within a day or two, he escaped and was running loose in the house.
Of course.
But fortunately, my collies found him in the middle of the night underneath the couch in the coils. And my father awakened me with, "Get down here and get your snake." It was hissing and striking and doing the bull snake thing,
Yep.
but a lot of fun times back then.
Oh, that's amazing. So after high school, I mean, realistically, I know a lot of people are kind of curious, but when did you decide to get into corn snakes?
Well, I was just into snakes in general, reptiles too, but snakes especially.
Mhm.
And I belonged to the Herpetological Society up in Wisconsin when I was growing up. But I didn't want to stay in Wisconsin. That didn't seem like a place for a herper to be. So I had my eye towards other things. And by the time I graduated high school and 2 or 3 years later, I got the opportunity to start a traveling reptile exhibit based out of San Antonio, Texas, with
Oh
a
wow.
partner. So we did that for a few years and went all over the place in the United States, pretty much all the different corners of the country. And after doing that a couple of years, my future husband came to work for us
Oh wow.
and worked for us for a while. And we finally decided we liked each other better than doing the reptile traveling thing. And we wanted to settle somewhere and do something more permanent. Breeding was just beginning back then in the early to mid 70s. And that's what we wanted to try our hand in. That was hard to do while you're traveling.
Right.
So we settled in Florida, where his parents had brought him when he was 15. Seemed like a good place for a herper.
Oh wow, that's really cool because I know that's kind of where you guys were really established for quite a while, right?
I spent most of my adult life in Florida and Southwest Florida.
Oh wow, cool. So you said like just getting started breeding back in like the 70s, what were most people really working with back then? Because right now everyone knows ball pythons.
Nobody really bred ball pythons back then. For one thing, they were just, brown and gold ball pythons. It
Right.
wasn't until people started finding some different morphs that it got really exciting. But colubrids, people started with colubrids, a lot of the tricolor colubrids and the rat snakes and corn snakes, but colubrids in general. And there were a lot of people, maybe not a lot of people, but the bulk of the people were actually out here in the Southwest, from Joe Laszlo in San Antonio to people out in Arizona and Southern California. So that was really exciting. And I always like color and variability. So corn snakes and other bright colored colubrids really caught my eye. Yeah, and we got a chance to get some real pretty corn snakes. And being there in Southwest Florida, we'd go down to the Miami wholesalers and be able to pick through their bins. We were the ones that came up with the name Miami phase, from picking through ones that had the real pretty gray and orange colors to them. So that was a pretty exciting time.
Oh wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I know. I've read some of your stuff, and I knew that, but I was really looking forward to that. I'm sure a lot of people who are into corns have heard of the Miami phase, but talking to the person who really got it started is really cool.
What was really great is when you could pick through the bins of hundreds and hundreds of them and pick out the very best ones, take them back, and then start selectively breeding them. So my idea was that we were kind of going for the look of light phase Blair's king snake, and some of them did kind of look like that.
That's so cool. Yeah, I know they kind of have that really cool like gray metallic sheen sometimes. That's amazing. Is that kind of the first like more phase that you started line breeding before, or did you just kind of like went head over heels into the ability to just kind of go in a bunch of different routes because you had the ability to do so?
Well, we just bred a few of those and a few of a little bit of everything else when we settled down. In 1979, we got married and settled in Southwest Florida, got our own place, a mobile home on 2 acres. And we had a rather eclectic collection of some pythons, some boas, some colubrids. We even had a cobra and some tree vipers, a little bit of everything. And
Right.
so we weren't especially into the corn snakes, but I certainly enjoyed them. So as we got into the 80s and finally built a building in 1986, I believe, that's when we could really get into breeding a lot of different things. I think we had our first albino baby corn snakes in about 1986 or so. So once we started breeding large numbers of a particular species, then we began to see the natural variability. And even with the albino corns at that time, they were relatively new, not completely new, but they were very much in demand, and we were wholesaling 100 lots of them to the places in Miami.
Oh,
And
wow.
we began to see that some of the albino corn snakes had a lot of white, some had no white, some had big white rings. They had quite a different look, even though they were all albino corns. So we started breeding like to try to make the most extreme ones more extreme. And as far as I know, the first named variety of any kind of reptile that wasn't just a genetic recessive trait like amelanistic or something like that was what we called the no white albino, and later renamed the sunglow albino. And shortly after that, the albino okatee, which we also called reverse okatee,
Right.
because those were the two extremes of the albino corn snakes that we were breeding. So shortly after that, when people saw what some selective breeding could do besides just having a recessive trait, uh, they got into it in a lot of different species, not just corn snakes.
That's amazing. That's so cool. I know that, we've lost a few of the different morphs and localities and things of a lot of the different colubrids. Did you used to work with any of the cool stuff that just kind of isn't around anymore?
Well, not so much. There were a lot of people back then that were into the localities. There still are, but
Hmm.
some of them were like super into the localities. They'd only want to breed things together that were found with either they or their parents within a few miles apart. I was never as much into the locality because for me, the appearance of the animal was what I was going for. But I thought that was nice that there's room for all different kinds of interests. So we did a little bit of everything, but I'm not thinking too much. Well, I guess one of the things we did in the 90s that I don't see around too much are the really big diadem rat snakes, the royal diadem rat snakes.
Yeah.
Now the ones in that genus that you see tend to be the smaller species. So I'm not sure what happened to those. I guess there's probably a few around somewhere.
Maybe somewhere rolling around if somebody got like maybe some of Applegate's collection or something.
Don't remember him working with those, but he had a lot of cool stuff.
True. So when like we'll kind of roll this way. So, you kind of got started really going whole hog into it in, like come like the mid to late 80s into the 90s. Is that when you decided to start up Reptile Industries?
No, Reptile Industries is Mark Bell. Mark
Oh,
and Kim
right.
Bell.
I'm sorry. I knew. I don't know why I did that. I'm apologies. Sorry about that.
No, we actually started in September of 1989, Glades Herp with
There it
Rob.
is. Yeah, I apologize. Sorry about that.
And at that time, Tom Crutchfield had his reptile shop right there in Fort Myers in the same, general area that we did. And then later he moved, but he was there. Gulf Coast Reptiles was also in town around about that time, maybe a little before us. So there were some reptile shops around, but Glades was mainly started as uh, uh, there was no online in 1989,
Right.
but a mail order place,
Because
and we
that's
had a
how.
big old warehouse.
Yeah. Did you used
But
to do a
the
lot of that mail
same
order stuff?
year,
Oh, I'm sorry.
oh, we did mostly all mail order, but on Saturdays some people would come in for their mice and whatever they're looking for. But we decided to move to the east side of Fort Myers and take over an old convenience store, like a 7-Eleven type store. And we did that right about the same time that the first Jurassic Park came out.
Oh,
And
wow.
that gave a real boost. People were real excited about getting their own dinosaur about that time.
I bet. I was gonna say, around that time, I know you were especially interested in snakes, but did you kind of have like a boom of like the iguana and the lizards too because of that movie, or just kind of reptiles in general?
I think it was reptiles in general. There was a big boost during the time that we were part of Glades Herp from late 89 until about 1995 when we left to do our own home business again. And Rob kept on with that business. But during the time that we were there, people got a real interest in reptiles, not only from Jurassic Park and other movies that were out, but just the success. And from the time that we started, there were no such businesses like T-Rex and other suppliers like that. They came during that time when we were there, and we went from having to find our own like expired medical supplies and other things that weren't intended for reptiles to being able to just buy stuff that was ready made just for us. And of course, that's about the time the internet started getting popular. When we first started Glades Herp, nobody had any internet. But by the time we left in 95, we were just starting to put all of our price lists online and not necessarily having to make 5,000 of them and mail them out every month.
Oh, wow, that's crazy. So did that used to be a bit of a challenge before like the accessibility of ready-made commercial products and supplies for reptiles? Was that something that you just we lost you for a second.
Am I back yet?
I still have you on audio.
Just a minute.
Uh-oh. Always have technical difficulties, unfortunately. Um, I think she's working on her phone, so probably have a little bit of connectivity issue, or possibly even there's something going on my end. It's super windy right now, so I'll just kind of vamp for a little bit. But I'm a little embarrassed about totally confused Reptile Industries and Glades Herb. That is 100% on me. Yeah, that was bad. I know. I always try to do my best to, like, I know Kathy Love and her husband have done quite a bit over the years, and I always try to refresh about that. But Reptile Industries popped up around that same time, and I think it stuck in my head, unfortunately. But yeah, no, it's really cool and crazy. It's like truly, Kathy Love is one of the like matriarchs of herpetoculture, and so hopefully we can continue with this and we can learn some really cool stuff. Um, shoot, where were we?
Yeah.
Oh, I was about the commercially available reptile products. Both
Oh
for
yes, we were talking about T-Rex and
Yep.
other ones like that. Uh, so it was actually kind of interesting way back before there were those things because you had to be really creative. I had one medical supply company that would sell me really cheap expired like catheter bags and IV bags, and we would use those and sell them for chameleon waterers.
Oh,
And we would go through and look through all kinds of different sorts of stores looking for things that were made for something entirely different than reptiles, but that we could make into something. So it was kind of fun and creative.
that's really cool. Um, Actually, since you brought it up, I know a lot of people really ask about corn snake content and asking stuff about that. So that's why I end up usually keep going back to those. But since you brought
Mm-hmm.
up the chameleon bag, did you notice kind of like a big upshift in the availability and the want of chameleons after like kind of like the UV bulbs came out? So people outside of like Florida and Texas were able to start keeping them a little bit longer.
My personal thought is that I think it followed the chameleon craze rather than produced the chameleon
Oh,
craze,
okay.
and other lizards too, of course, not
Mm-hmm.
just chameleons. Because at the beginning, people were much more into keeping snakes because they're a lot easier than most lizards,
Right.
uh, except for the people who would keep the lizards outside, especially the ones that really need UV light. Uh, Way back in the 70s, uh, uh, Joe Laszlo had experimented with Vitalites,
Mm-hmm.
and they were available way back then before I ever even knew about them. And I believe they came about because of Paul Ott, who actually wrote a book about the need for UV and also just natural spectrum lighting for human health. And it really opened my eyes back when I first read that back, I guess, in the 70s, probably. And they did experiments with people living under or working for long hours under different color lights and how it impacted their health. And just from that stuff done with humans, they kind of extrapolated that and took it into other animals and then did research on reptiles. So Joe Laszlo was really ahead of his time in using that. I don't know of anybody who used UV lights before he did.
Wow, that's really cool. Interesting. I just thought that's really interesting. Cool. Um, so with that, kind of with the availability and the more wider variety of all the different morphs and most of like a lot of the colubrids and things like that, um, did Glades Herp just kind of explode? Like just
It was amazing to me. It got big really fast, much faster than we thought it would. When we first started it, it was pretty much just Bill and myself and Rob. And I think we had a part timer or two, but within months, we were hiring more people to help. And the thing just exploded. We did more business than I ever thought we would, but we also had more expenses than I ever thought we would.
right.
So it seemed like we were always kind of catching up for finances because it's so expensive to take care of so many animals. But I certainly learned a lot during that time. And I got more exposure because Rob had been working at places like Pet Farm and doing the importation, whereas Bill and I primarily were working with captive bred animals and things that that you might be able to captive breed way back then. And of course, Bill had done a lot of looking for snakes and lizards and things like that in the wild, much more than I had. But Rob brought a whole new perspective to the table because neither Bill or I had ever worked for an importer. Well, Bill did work for Tom Crutchfield for a while, but Tom wasn't a big importer at the time. He did a little bit of that, but more often he bought things from the importers rather than got the full exposure to huge importations himself.
Crazy. So at that time, I know you said that you went from like your personal little trailer to like to another building, and then eventually to that convenience store. Was there more expansion that happened in between then?
No, basically we started it as a home business with a building in the back of our 2 acres. And then when Rob decided he wanted to get out of Miami and do something else, and we decided to form a partnership, that's when we got the big warehouse. But we still did a lot of the colubrid breeding at our place and then brought the babies into the warehouse. And then from the warehouse to that convenience store. And then after that, when we left to go back to our beginnings with a building on our property, which by then we had 10 acres with a bigger house. And we went back to those roots, and Bill started taking people on tours to Madagascar. And he started doing a lot more photography, which was his passion, and selling of photos and writing for Reptiles magazine and that sort of thing. Whereas Rob eventually moved the business more to central or west Florida, further north than we were.
Okay. So then it kind of consolidated back down a little bit.
For us, it became a home business again, and I mostly did the breeding of the reptiles as a home business, and Bill mostly did the tours of Madagascar and photography and sales of photography, and he wrote some pet keeping books. Of course, the two of us together wrote the first corn snake book, and then also the updated version, which I think the updated version was in 2005, and that was the Corn Snakes, the Comprehensive Owner's Guide. And I don't think there's really another corn snake book that's come out since then that's more detailed or bigger.
I don't believe so. I know I'm looking to acquire that one. I have your original one. But I went more towards boa constrictors than I did corn snakes. So I'm still learning even more about those as we go along too. That's really cool. So then, I mean, by that point, this was what, around the early 2000s by this point?
During what? Then when we left Blades Herb?
Yes.
We left Blades Herb in 1995.
Okay.
And then at that time, we had a house on 20 acres eventually in Alva, Florida. So when we left Blades Herb, we built kind of a big Quonset style building to house our reptiles on our 20 acres. And from then until about 2010 or 11, we did breeding and Bill's stuff that he was doing too with the photography. And that's pretty much what we did at the time.
Cool. So still doing probably a good amount of numbers at that point. I mean, probably nothing like it was back when you had the multiple buildings, but still probably doing a fair amount of large numbers.
No, not really. I just turned 70 this last Saturday.
Oh,
so
happy birthday.
Fairly retired now, but I still produce a handful of corn snakes every year. And my newer project that I've been doing for several years is Tricolor Hognose from South America. Cool. I actually produce more of those than corn snakes usually. And I do some blue tongue skinks, and I still have a pair of Amazon tree boas and a few Western hognose, a little of this and that. But it's really a hobby business at this point.
Oh, cool. That's really fun. I know a lot of people, especially here in Colorado, we're actually not able to keep hognose. But everyone's really interested and excited about that. And I was hoping we'd eventually get to the point where I could ask you kind of about the tricolor hognose, because I know they're a little bit different than our westerns and plains.
Oh, they're very different.
Yeah.
The only thing they really share is the upturned nose.
Yep.
But the tricolor hognose have become a real favorite project of mine. There aren't any real morphs to speak of yet on those. Somebody in Europe is breeding some that seem to be low red. They're not real beautiful, but they're different. But what I am seeing a lot of is pattern variations, which are not just simple recessive traits, but selective breeding. And I think you're going to see a lot of pattern abnormalities that people will be breeding in. But so far, I haven't seen the more common recessive traits like, lacking black, amelanistic, or any of those typical things like that.
I think it's just because we have a smaller base number and it's just taken a little bit longer to get there.
I think it's maybe the luck of the draw. The Europeans were actually breeding these long before we were. And I think there's quite a bit of founding stock in Europe. And when we had Glades herp in the 90s, we actually did import some adults of the species. It got fresh imports from South America, but they didn't do well at all. At that time, nobody had even seen them in this country. Well, maybe a few people, but not usually. And most of the ones that we either kept or sold ended up dying. They just didn't do well. But a few of them survived, and a few people started breeding them, and then also got some from Europe. So we've merged some of the stock. But I think they just haven't turned up. They probably will eventually.
Right. Yeah. I guess it is kind of that random mutation that just kind of pops up, and we just have to kind of keep it trucking along.
Yeah, if people could still get some occasional imports from the wild, that probably would increase the chances with having bigger founder stock that gene is lurking in there somewhere.
True. Where are they originally from? I know they're from South America, but I don't actually know too much about them.
Well, they occur over a few countries. Bill concentrated on Paraguay because he wanted to see them in the wild. And Bert Langerwerf had seen them in particular places in Paraguay. And so Bill went down there to the little town of Philadelphia, but it's spelled with an F, not PH. And he did stay down there, didn't actually see any, but he did see the exact habitat where other people have seen them. And he took lots of pictures. And he saw some other things down there. Unfortunately, he got a fairly severe bite by another rare-fanged snake, a little cat-eye snake down there. Ooh. And he ended up in the hospital down there from it.
Oh, jeez.
So he hasn't been back.
Oh man, is that kind of why you really decided to move towards the tricolors? Is just because of the trips down there to enjoying seeing certain...
No, not really. He went down there partly. I mean, he always liked exploring every different area he could go to where there's reptiles. But he went down there specifically for hopefully trying to find out more natural history information firsthand about them, because I was already working with them at that time.
Oh, okay.
Of course, they are a rear-fanged snake too. Mm-hmm. And from everybody that I've talked to on the various forums who has been bitten by them, that's something I've avoided so far. They seem to have a reaction very much like Western hognose. Okay. Everybody who's ever been bitten by them, usually on the hand because they got their hands too close when they're feeding them, has had swelling and itching and burning, sometimes all the way up to the elbow. But I haven't seen anybody who's ever required any medical attention for a bite from them.
Interesting.
So when I sell them, I tell them don't let little kids handle them, especially unsupervised. But they generally don't bite defensively. I've never had one try to bite defensively. They'll actually spread a small hood a little bit like some of the more eastern type hognose, but not as big as that. But I've never seen them actually try to bite. The only times I've ever gotten close to being bitten was the females. The adult females are just hungry all the time, and anything that moves is food. And if your hands get in the way, well, grab first, ask questions later.
Right.
It is pretty interesting, the behaviors that I've seen in them, feeding behaviors, very much like water snakes and garter snakes. When they get excited and hungry, they'll kind of swing their head from side to side very quickly, as if they're in the water trying to scoop up fish or salamanders or frogs or whatever they can grab. And just seeing how close the feeding behavior is to water snakes and garter snakes does make me think that they might feed similarly in the wild.
Really interesting. That's really cool. Do they sometimes have issues getting started on rodents, like sometimes the Easterns do?
No, I found them easier to start on rodents than corn snakes are.
Wow, because I know sometimes those little baby corns can give people quite the headache. But cool.
Most corns will start pretty easily, but there's always a few that don't want to.
Right.
And you'll run across a little tricolor hog that doesn't want to sometimes too. But almost all of the ones that don't start on thawed pinkies in a deli cup will start on a scented pinky that has some sort of fish smeared on it, whether it's salmon or tuna or some other kind of fish, or occasionally frogs or toads. Very few of them, very, very few of them won't start that way. They're much easier than Western hognose to get started.
Wow, that's really cool.
And unlike corn snakes, they seem to prefer thawed pinkies. A lot of times with corn snakes, they really want a live, warm one bouncing around there to get them excited to feed.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems to scare the baby tricolor hogs. And very few of the little babies will eat live ones. They will after they've had a couple dozen and they're not scared anymore. But they really prefer the thawed to start with.
Wow, that's really cool. I never would have thought that. That's really crazy.
They're really interesting. Unfortunately, they're a live fast, die young species.
Oh, really?
Like a lot of chickens. And they're very prolific. They eat a lot, grow fast when they're babies. I've had them breeding at a little less than a year and a half old.
Whoa.
But by the time they're 4 or so, they're starting to get a little geriatric. I've had very few over the age of 4 that laid 4 eggs. And by the time they're 5, a lot of them have died. The longest lived one I've ever heard about from anybody on any of the forums was 8, but most of them don't live beyond 6 or 7, and most of mine have been lucky to get even close to that, especially the females. But the males don't live a lot longer.
Huh. Do you think that's maybe why people had a hard time with them early on, because they were getting in adults that were already had a couple of years on them?
It could be. But my gut feeling is probably that they grew up eating things that weren't rodents,
mm-hmm.
and maybe even just different species of cold-blooded prey, and they just weren't adjusting because most of them did not eat well at all.
Really, that's really interesting. Like, I'd heard that they were kind of short-lived, but I didn't know it was that short-lived. That's crazy. It's really interesting.
It is short. Although some lizards do that or less.
True.
But they're very prolific, so you can always raise replacements.
Very true. It's like a lot of the different chameleon species too, huh?
Yeah, even bearded dragons aren't real long-lived.
Very true. Wow, that's really cool. Huh. Interesting. I always really like the hoggies because we don't really have access to them where we're at. So anybody who works with them, I usually end up kind of picking their brain a little bit about them. So
I've got some that I'm raising up now, some different morphs. I had bred them a few times back in the mid 80s or so, but I got a little bored with them because I really like color and variability, and at that time there wasn't any, and the babies were kind of hard to start, and they weren't in great demand. And it just seemed at that time when I bred them, they were going for $35 each as babies. And it just seemed like a lot of work to get them started for that price, and to know that they were all going to look very similar to each other. So
Fair.
I bred them a few years and then got out of them.
That makes sense. Is that kind of why you got into the tricolors, just because of how bright they were?
I do like that. Another interesting thing about the tricolor hogs, and I never thought about it too much when I had raised tricolor, king snake types like the various milk snakes.
Mm-hmm.
But all of these coral snake mimics, whether they're tricolor milk snakes or the tricolor hogs, I if you notice, some species more than others, but coral snakes, eastern coral snakes from Florida, for example, if you catch them, they are very spastic and just jump around real crazily, just real spastic. And so are some of the various milk snakes. I especially noticed that we used to breed a long time ago Honduran milks, and the youngsters are totally spastic, very much like coral snakes. And I didn't think about it that much until I started producing the Tricolor Hognose. And the babies of those are also totally spastic, very much like many of the milk snakes and the coral snakes. So they all share that in common.
Interesting. That's really cool, because I know it's that mimicry for defense, but wow, that's really interesting. So they do a little bit of behavioral mimicry too. Crazy.
They do. Now the adults, even the yearlings, if they get handled even a minimal amount, they lose that, and they tend to be very, very calm.
Yeah, because I know I haven't bred any of the. I have a couple different tricolor stuff, and I got them as essentially like 2 year olds. So right at getting close to being true adults, and all but one like white face Honduran, they've all just been pretty chill, all things considered, after just a couple of weeks of handling. But interesting. That's
We
really
used to
cool.
breed a lot of Hondurans way back. Oh, that was probably soon after we left Glades Herp. We actually got a hold of the first hypo that we called the Tangerine Dream,
Yeah.
and an importer who thought it was a coral snake. And we noticed just how bright and how beautiful it was. And all the others at the time tended to be kind of ugly with a lot of black intrusion into the lighter colors. So we bred this one to the best one we could find. And by the time we were getting second, third generation, we noticed that some of the babies resembled grandpa. And that started that whole dynasty. As far as
Wow.
I know, pretty much all the ones that are now available from this kind of tangerine dream hypotype
Right.
probably are descended from that male, either most or all of them.
Wow. So I have a couple of great grandbabies from you, I guess.
Yeah, it's amazing what a dynasty he started. He was so beautiful, but those babies tended to be extremely spastic, and they retained it for quite some time. But with handling, they lost it.
Interesting. I know. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's crazy. Hmm. I had never even thought about that. That's really cool. Um, I mean, yeah, that's crazy. Sorry, I really like that. Like I really got into like the Pituophis, like the bull snake
Uh-huh.
kinds, and I really like their like rattlesnake mimicry and all of their kind of eccentricities and their shared behavior throughout a lot of the different species of the genus. So it's really cool when I hear about that a lot of people just kind of don't even think about. That's really cool.
I think it is so interesting. It takes a lot of years and a lot of varied experiences. And then sometimes you don't put two and two together until after you've already gotten 15 or 20. And then you go
Oh,
back and think, wow, that reminds me a lot of something that I used to see way back when. So it's kind of exciting being in something like this for so long, not only because you get a chance to see such a variety of animals over such a long time, but also the people. I still have some friends now that I met back in the 70s, back when we were traveling with the reptile exhibit,
mhm.
and many from the 80s and the 90s. Some of them from other countries, got reptile friends from Russia and Europe and Australia. So it's been really exciting to be a part of something that's gotten so big and has lasted so long.
That's so cool. That's just absolutely amazing. I love that. Like, I mean, how many different, essentially kind of keystone animals do you think that you helped establish into the hobby at this point?
Well, in most cases, we weren't the very first ones with the species, but in some cases, we were among the early ones.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of miss those old Sphaerosophus, those royal diadems, because we really got a lot of those out, and now they've kind of disappeared. But the tricolors, I wasn't the first, but I was among some of the earlier breeders. And when I first started with them, not that many years ago, there were only a few people in the U.S. that were breeding them. More in Europe, though. And the forums here on Facebook for Tricolor Hogs only had like a handful of people, and now I think one of them has 2,000 some people on it or something like that.
Wow.
So it's amazing how some of these things have gained in popularity.
Have you noticed like any changing shifts of different species like that, other than the hoggies and I mean obviously ball pythons?
It does appear to me that people seem to like short, fat snakes.
Yeah.
If you think about what's popular, and because we used to go to a lot of expos, now I only go to one or two a year, but we used to go to a lot of expos, especially in Florida, where there were so many of them. And so we would get a lot of comments from the general public, or what I call pet keepers,
Mm-hmm.
people who aren't serious herpers, but they've got a couple of pet snakes or lizards, and they like them as pets rather than to study nature or reptiles or whatever. So I would hear a lot of comments from those kind of people about what they liked and what they didn't like. And often when I was producing a lot of corn snakes, I would get, they're so skinny, they're so little.
Oh.
But the ball pythons and the hognose, and even the tricolor hognose, although they're not as heavy as the westerns, they're heavier than the corns for their length. Yeah, and I would get a lot of that. Oh, they're so cute! Look at how fat he is.
That's really interesting. That's people are interesting about that kind of stuff. I always thought that was kind of weird with their different like the shifts and change of people that really seem to like them. Like I definitely know like the hognose, like the Western hognose, now that there are a few different morphs out there, they're getting very popular and subsequently very expensive, and the ball pythons are never going away. And now it seems like the Dumerals boas, which are kind of like the chunkier boas, are getting really popular now too.
I did have some Dumerals boas. I even had a pair. I never actually produced them, but back when I had them, oh, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, I would look at them at the shows sometimes, and they were typically going babies for about $125, $150 each. And I always thought that they should go for more, because when you do produce them, you only usually get around 10 babies, give or take a couple. So they're not like a prolific producer like a red tail or something.
Right.
And that seemed awful cheap for something that isn't that prolific. But I think one of the things that has held them back is that there are no morphs. And one Dumerals, some are a little more orange than others, but they look very similar to each other. They don't
That's
have
true.
that variability. If anybody comes out with some albinos or something that looks radically different from all the others, I would predict that they'll get a lot of interest. They do get a little big and heavy for your average person.
True, they
but
do.
at least they're not a reticulated python or a Burmese python.
Yeah, that's that I do I a lot of times when people ask about big snakes, I usually advocate for something like that. And you're right, if a morph ever popped out of there, that would turn everything kind of on its heads a little bit, because that's a little bit more of a manageable snake, like you said, than like a retic or a Burmese python or something similar.
And we did get in on the albino Burmese back in the 90s when they were popular. We produced quite a few albinos and normals. But after a number of years, they're just so big and so heavy to lug around, and we
Yeah.
weren't getting any younger. So we finally got out of the big ones. I had a couple of retics over the years, never bred them. But now that some people have really small super dwarfs, a few breeders have some that are staying well under 10 feet, even 7 feet. That's something that I would really like to see all the morphs become available in, and some are, but they're expensive.
Oh yeah, they are.
So few people are equipped to be able to properly house and care for a regular sized retic or Burmese python or any of those African rocks, which usually are not too friendly anyway. Yeah. But the super dwarf retics, if that would be primarily what was available, then I think you wouldn't have so much of a backlash against people who are improperly keeping the big ones.
That's true. You're definitely right. I know there are people working on that. There's a couple pretty prominent people, but they're definitely still carrying that big price tag, and it's probably going to stick around that way for the foreseeable future.
I think so. I've even considered getting some super dwarfs in one of the colors that I really like. But even a 6 or 7 foot snake, now that I'm getting older and we live in a smaller retirement place, I've got a couple of stillwater bull snakes, and even housing those as adults, I just don't have the kind of room that I used to have. So I'm very selective on anything I get that's going to be much bigger than a corn snake or something that size.
Fair. And that's a very responsible thing that I wish a few more people came to their conclusion without a lot of experience and a lot of mistakes, unfortunately.
Well, when I was in my 20s, I was right there with them. I wanted the biggest snake I could get.
Fair.
Because it was exciting. And when you're young, it's more exciting to think of that end of it than what you're going to do with it. But hopefully, as people get into their 30s and 40s, they don't let the excitement override their practical nature.
Yeah, that's definitely true. We've all been there. We're all a little bit guilty of it too, for sure. That's really cool. So, as you said before, it's mostly just kind of the hobby, and you're mostly breeding kind of a small amount of corn snakes and the tricolors. Are you breeding anything else?
Blue tongue skinks.
Oh yeah.
I produced my biggest year ever last year. 30 of them from 2 different females. They each had 15.
Oh wow, aren't those kind of a larger size litter?
That is on the larger side. I had as few as 4 once from one of the younger ones, and as many as 16. Never had more than 16.
Oh,
so
wow.
Those are both pretty good sized litters, which I'm glad I don't have more, because again, space is at a premium, right? And their babies are best housed singly, and I couldn't do that last year because it was just too many to give them each a cage with the lights on. So I had to find new homes for some groups of them before they overran my place.
Oh, jeez. And those are I'm assuming the northern blue tongue skinks?
The northerns. And they are so much fun to raise because you practically can see them grow day by day. And it's fun to see anything grow like that.
Yeah, I bet. That's really, really cool. I have a lot of like the more slow growers, other than a couple of like, the bull snakes and pines that just kind of explode after a little while. But that's really cool. It's really fun.
So I just, I just worked on my taxes today, and it's still a business, but it's kind of more of a hobby-sized one-person business. Bill is not involved in it anymore, so it's just what I can do as one person on a very part-time basis.
Fair enough. Are you still talking to some of the people on the Facebook groups and stuff like that? I see your name pop up every once in a while, so.
I'm actually very active on quite a few Facebook reptile groups. There are so many different ones for corn snakes.
Fair.
I'm not active a lot on any one particular one of them, but I visit a whole bunch of them occasionally. But I also belong to Facebook groups for blue tongue skinks and tricolor hognose and western hognose and oh man, there's one for female herpers and I probably belong to several dozen different groups, and so I go to various different ones at different times.
Cool. That's really fun. So if people were curious about anything in particular, they could reach out to you. I know you were pretty quick about responding back to me, just a random person on the internet. So
I do, as I've gotten older now and I'm not out there climbing rocks and stuff so much. I spend more time on the computer than I used to. So I'm always answering emails. I still get people asking me questions about how to take care of the corn snake and the tricolor hognose. I've written up some care sheets that I just copy and paste and send to them, but I answer questions a lot. Basically, I try to give back to the hobby because I've been involved in it since before it was a mainstream hobby.
right.
I think I probably joined the Southeastern Wisconsin Herpetological Society while I was in high school, about 1968 or something like that.
Oh wow.
And I had a couple of snakes a couple of years before that. So I've been involved in it so long, and I've had so many people that I've gotten to know and so many friends that have really enhanced my life that I like to try to give back if I can.
Cool. That's amazing. Um, I mostly wanted to talk to you, but I did have a question. I know that Bill, for a good amount of time, was doing a lot of the traveling and photography. Did you ever join him on any of those trips?
I did go with him to Madagascar on his second trip to Madagascar back in 1992, I think it was. And then I went there one time without him, right after we left Glades Herp. On that same trip, we stopped in Europe and met some European herpers too, in Germany and the Netherlands. Most of the trips I didn't go with him because during the time he was doing a lot of the traveling, was when we lived in Florida and the reptiles were a full-time business.
Right.
And I would stay there and take care of the animals while he went off on trips. Yeah, and the trips to Madagascar were actually tours that he took people in. He didn't make a ton of money, but he paid for his own trip and made a little extra. So it was a business thing that he was doing as well as something for fun.
Mm-hmm. I was just kind of curious because I know that's what it seemed like in my brain, thinking of how that worked out, is you were kind of taking care of things back at home. And I know those, when you're popping out a bunch of babies all at once, that's a full-time job and then some.
I used to produce, I think, 2,500 to 3,000 baby colubrids a year. At one point, that would have been back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. About 2005, 2006, when the recession started slowing things down before it really hit bad, one of the first things that happened was people weren't buying as many reptiles. And so I started cutting back about that time, 2005 or so, mainly because it just wasn't financially feasible to do as many at that time. And so I slowly cut back, but I was still doing it full time until we left Florida around 2011 or somewhere around there. And then when we moved out here, I didn't bring as many with me because we bought this as our retirement home, and we were going to be doing this more as a very part-time business at that point.
Fair. I mean, I couldn't imagine that. 3,000 colubrid babies a year. Did you ever try to space them out, or were you?
A lot of them were corn snakes, but there were also a number of king snakes and milk snakes and rat snakes, mostly North American with a couple of Asian species. So yeah, a lot of them. I was also producing a lot of Amazon tree boas. I mean, not like the colubrids, but I actually had, I think, third generation that we were selectively breeding for yellows and some oranges, but mostly yellows. So that was kind of a big thing back then, and they did really well in that climate. I actually put them out in our screen pool area for most of the summer, from about late March until November. They would be outside, and then I'd bring them in for the winter. They did very well there. Now I'm down to just one pair because they don't do nearly as well here. And when I did have babies, I didn't have as good a luck with the babies getting them feeding and going. So I've just got one pair kind of for old time's sake now.
Wow, that's crazy. I honestly can't even imagine. That's insane to me.
Well, it was my full-time job back then, although Bill was not too involved. He was always the carpenter and fixer-upper and making new things for me, but not involved in the animals so much. Of course, I bred some rodents too, but not all I needed. And I had one part-time helper that would especially help me during baby season. So, but now it's much more manageable, and I only keep the kinds I like. I specialize in Okatee corns and ultramel Okatees. I am raising up some baby palmettos for the future. But those Okatees tended to always be my favorites. And I always said if I ever retire, I'll probably just have Okatees. So now it's kind of that less is more. And you can really appreciate each individual animal now when you just have I have maybe a couple dozen adult snakes of all different kinds. And during baby season, I might have up to a couple hundred or less, depends on the year.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. I really like the Okatees too. Like I drove out to Tinley for the NRBC show, and then I left with a corn snake, and it was just one of the nicest Okatees that I had seen, because I don't breed too many corn snakes. I just really love them as a species. And so whenever I find a really nice looking one, and it's usually the Okatees, or suppose that there's a lot of stuff about like the Tessera gene or whatever, but I do really like those.
Not been very fond of those. I've never actually had one.
Oh. Uh-oh.
Let me fell right out of my hand. I've never had one and never had any real desire to have one. The striped look of the corn snakes didn't do too much for me. I like the banded patterns.
Yeah, I know wasn't that the whole thing that a lot of people think that are like they're a cross, they're like a jungle corn of some kind.
Oh, different people might think that. I haven't actually been seeing as many of the hybrids lately as I used to, but part of it could be that I don't go to as many shows as I used to too.
It's a ball python pit around the places where I'm at, but when I do see them, I see a lot of Cali Kings. I'm starting to see a lot of locality Cali Kings. And a few odds and ends. I've seen a lot of Sinaloans lately. A lot of Sinaloan milk snakes. Those seem to be getting popular again for some reason. But cool. Anyway, I just really want to thank you for that. This was really cool. I got to learn quite a few new things from you today. That was amazing. And again, if anybody's interested in talking to you, they can just kind of reach out and get back to in kind.
Sure, they can always email me. My address, I think, is on my website, cornutopia.com, but I'm very active on Facebook. I can't always take new friend requests because they require you to stay less than 5,000, and I'm usually kind of bumping up against the limit. But now and then somebody leaves, and then I'll take on somebody new. But they could still send me a message through there or through one of the various reptile forums that I'm on. Usually if I'm a member there and somebody mentions my name, it'll show up in my feed and I'll go see what they're talking about.
Cool. And if somebody wanted to acquire an animal from you, they just probably go to your website.
Yeah, I don't keep it up too much because Bill doesn't do that anymore. And I do have a guy that updates it every year or two for me, but I don't put the new babies on there. I actually, when I do take baby pictures, I put them on my Facebook page. I have a Cornutopia page too on Facebook, and I'll sometimes put the babies up on there. Facebook has gotten a lot pickier this last year or so about trying to sell any live animals on Facebook.
True.
So now you just put the pictures up and people will figure it out and talk to you if they're interested.
That works. Cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me a little bit of your time this afternoon or evening. Or
It's always fun to talk about my favorite subject.
That's what I always like to say. Like, even if it's, not the best weekend, or you do a show or whatever it is, it's not as productive or monetarily productive as you'd like. You still get to talk reptiles.
Exactly. And I've made so many friends that I get to talk with them, and Facebook has been a great connector. So I'm just grateful to have so many friends from all over the US and all over the world who share my passion.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, again, thank you again so much. If anybody has questions, feel free to contact me, and, go through one of the many Facebook forums or email Kathy. It's great to, be able to talk to someone who just had an amazing influence on the community as a whole. It was great.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.